On January 12, 2023, my life was essentially changed forever. You see, I like hyper-focusing on series that I will go through on stream, and previously I had just finished going through the Mega Man Battle Network games the year prior, and before that, the Kirby series. I know eventually one day I would tackle one of the longest running JRPG series on stream, so I had been researching and collecting a variety of games and necessary consoles over the past while in order to complete this endeavor. Maybe one day I'll get to the first longest running and still insanely popular JRPG series, Dragon Quest, but this video is going to be a recollection of my thoughts and ultimately a review of the entire mainline Final Fantasy series. Which means no 14 or 11 because I don't consider them mainline even if they are numbered entries. Growing up, I had access to Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls for the GBA. However, since I was a very impatient kid that did not understand the concept of a turn-based RPG that was in Mario and Luigi or Pokemon, I didn't get very far in either title. While it would have made more sense to turn to this version in my Final Fantasy adventure, I really took a liking to how the sprites looked in the PSP version over the GBA and Steam ports. Final Fantasy I is a very simplistic JRPG that has you take the role of the 4 Warriors of Light. Taking more from the western side of D&D, you are able to create a band of 4 misfits that will be tasked to save the world from the clutches of chaos. This game is also the shortest in the entire series, granted if you use player-made maps or played via the Pixel Remaster. This game isn't too difficult and thus did not really need that much grinding. Anybody would be fine going through this game as long as they don't run away from everything, and ensure to purchase the new spells and gear as they venture around the world. I wouldn't really recommend this game to people who have shorter attention spans, as the random encounters can become quite troublesome, and in extreme cases will become tests of patience if you get lost in the many labyrinths and dungeons. But then again, because of its shorter length, I would be more likely to return to this game in order to try out different party compositions. Plus, in the PSP and GBA versions, there is extra content for the player to tackle. All in all, Final Fantasy I is a perfect introduction to the series for people that want to try out the archaic style of turn-based combat. Just don't be ashamed to rely on walkthroughs or maps as you go through these early titles. So I'll give it about a C. It's a perfectly average JRPG. The black sheep of the series, Final Fantasy II, is the first real attempt in the series to have an overarching story that this band of newly made orphans had to endure in their quest to save the world from the evil Emperor. Because of decades worth of bad word of mouth, there are many misconceptions about this title, the most infamous one being, in order to get more HP, you need to hit yourself in order to get through the game. Which, while semi-true, is not a requirement to get through the game. Granted, Final Fantasy II is more grindy than the previous entry. The unique leveling system really did stick with me after completing the game, and kinda made me wish there were more turn-based RPGs that would take notes of this system. I am aware of non-turn-based RPGs that have similar mechanics like the Elder Scrolls series, or even indie titles like Abiotic Factor that have a do more of this to make it stronger mechanic. But I am curious if someone can figure out a method of doing this in a turn-based RPG with some semblance of rigidity in order not to allow the tactics that people employ in Final Fantasy II. While I had braced myself for the worst because of everything I have heard, I was quickly impressed at what was attempted in this game. There are kernels of good ideas that were just probably not implemented in the best way throughout the game, like the leveling system and the keyword dialogue tree. There was a real attempt to be something a lot more than the previous entry, and it instantly was reflected in the first couple of minutes as you hear the battle music. While not going super far into the music side of things, Final Fantasy I's battle music and town themes were more jovial and almost something like out of a 80s cartoon, while Final Fantasy II's more somber and distressing songs paired really well with its overall theme. You're no longer starting out with saving a princess after all, you're out here to bring down the evil ruler who has taken everything from you, and soon, the world. Being more difficult than the previous game, Final Fantasy II requires more grinding to get through it, be it for money, for equipment, or for building up stats or magic. There is an element of customization through the leveling system, but there isn't really a big necessity to go for a hyper speciality thanks to the guest characters that would join along the way. Do be aware that enemies can appear in much larger groups than in many of the titles in the series, and if it is a big group of enemies that can paralyze or inflict similar status effects, be prepared to be slowly whittled down over the span of what feels like years. So I'll just give it a low C. It is charming, but it does have its flaws that make it a bit worse than the first game. Moving away from the PSP to the DS for the 3D remake of Final Fantasy III had me enjoy the charming low-poly art style that was easily upscalable via Mainline DS. I really do have a weakness to sharp pixels and polygons after all. Expanding the job system that was introduced in the original Final Fantasy, the 4 heroes in this title were able to mix and match their classes to suit the whims of the player. However, the debuff time that was inflicted onto the player due to class switching was notably a bit obnoxious at times, especially in some cases where you need to be a particular class in order to proceed with the game. Like the part where you had to be black mages in order to deal damage while under the mini spell. I did feel that this game was a bit more grindy than the previous game. The bosses here are notably much more difficult than the previous 2 games, and I remember having to take time in order to grind up levels. This game is pretty infamous for Garuda alone, and getting new classes up to speed will be a time sink for many, especially if you want to max them out. The story itself is not really much to write home about. It felt like it was going to be more of a lighthearted adventure that just happened to result in saving the world as the 4 heroes play dress up thanks to the crystal's power. This was also the first instance in the Final Fantasy series where the world really opens up into different phases as the story progresses. I'll give this game a B. It's above average, better than the previous 2 entries for sure. A favorite for many a Super Nintendo fan, Final Fantasy IV, is the first game in the series where I really felt like I was playing through a genuine feeling character-driven narrative. I had chosen to play through the 3D remake that was released on the DS due to already having it set up on Mainline DS. Do note that both 3D remakes on the DS do feel pretty sluggish when it comes to menus and overall gameplay versus their NES and Super Nintendo originals. This is especially felt when opening up the menus after a battle or needing to do something in that menu. However, this game really surprised me with its albeit crusty voice-acted cutscenes. While the full-motion video openings from the PS1 and PSP re-release of Final Fantasy I and II had their charm, there was something that really put me back in time as I heard the BitCrunch characters talk. Maybe that was just me wanting to relive the old Flipnote days. Another factor of me playing the DS version over the Super Nintendo original was the quality of life that was having a map on the bottom screen. Pulling up maps also rewarded the player, so it was a fun incentive to explore each area's nooks and crannies to their fullest extent. Exploring also proved to be useful when it came to getting more levels, as this version of Final Fantasy IV is the hardest game in the entire series, in my opinion. Being the first game to introduce the Active Time Battle or ATB system, Final Fantasy IV was revolutionary in the fact that it mixed in real-time and turn-based combat. There wasn't many battles that took advantage of the system outside of the tutorial battles like in 4 and 6, but it was still a breath of fresh air from the conventional press A 4 times and then either heal or press A 4 times again approach. Now with 5 party members, you have to wait just a bit longer before you can mash A 5 times and then see if you need to heal or not. Final Fantasy IV is probably the grandiest game in the classic era of Final Fantasy, at least in the 3D version. Even basic encounters can be extremely dangerous and can result in needing a multitude of Phoenix Downs after the fact. I remember needing to take multiple granny breaks throughout this playthrough, but since I had played this via Mainline DS, those were made quite trivial thanks to fast forwarding. Banter aside, I can really see how this game has become a cult classic for the Final Fantasy series. This was the first title to break the mold on the already tried and true turn-based combat by remixing it into a hybrid approach. The characters, while a bit cheesy at times, were charming, and there were multiple good moments throughout the game that really left an impression. I really did enjoy Cecil's redemption arc as he went from a dark knight into a paladin, to then later save the world with his love and the many friends he made along the way. So I'll easily give it an A. It's a fantastic entry point for newer JRPG fans. Final Fantasy V to me is the real underdog in the series. It is a step back in terms of story and characters compared to 4, but it is also an expansion and improvement on what made Final Fantasy III really great in my eyes. For Final Fantasy V, I had chosen to play a ROM hack that ported over the GBA script to the SNES original. This was mainly due to me having a preference on the Super Nintendo sound chip over the GBA one. However, this time, I had started playing these Final Fantasy entries on intended hardware instead of an emulator. So using an ancient EverDrive and an RGB modded SNES Junior, I jumped straight into the unknown. Final Fantasy V takes more of its gameplay foundation from Final Fantasy III, while also adapting the ATB system that was introduced in IV. Having an upgraded job system, Final Fantasy V lets you customize the characters to your liking as you go around the world trying to solve the issue of these exploding crystals. This does come with the drawback that was prevalent in III, however, with needing certain classes in order to progress at certain sections. While not every job class is a sure winner, there are some hallmarks that were formally introduced in this title that have lived on into future entries, like the Blue Mage. Granted, it feels like this game doesn't really take itself too seriously at most times. There was a lot of comedy relief situations that got a chuckle out of me, like when a Turtle Sage fought against XDeath by spinning around in its shell as if it were Gamera. But there were also other scenes like Galuf vs XDeath that stuck around with me after the fact. Actually, in general, I felt like XDeath as a villain really encapsulated Final Fantasy V as a whole. It really was like they were a Saturday morning cartoon villain, one day being humbled by an old turtle, the next day having a standoff against 3 hormone-driven teenagers and a little girl as the void consumes everything around them. Kind of reminds me of the dichotomy of Darth Vader in Star Wars Rebels versus literally everywhere else. And so I'll give this a B for Bards. Final Fantasy VI is probably one of the best JRPGs that I have ever played. Over the many years, I've heard many good things about this particular entry in the series, and I was pleasantly surprised at how true a lot of the points were in this game. Like with Final Fantasy V, I had tried to play a ROM hack version of this title in order to get a better script. However, this time, for some reason or another, that didn't work out. It was probably for the best, but my ancient EverDrive had some sort of vendetta against the T edition of Final Fantasy VI. So ultimately, I had just played the original USA release of Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy III. The version with Ted Woosley at his most infamous. While probably not the best way to experience this masterpiece, it sure felt like the most authentic way to. This version, after all, is what thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the US first fell in love with before recommending it to their friends or random people on the internet. Final Fantasy VI is a step ahead in nearly every aspect coming from its 2 Super Nintendo entries. Looking at some scenes side by side, you'd be hard-pressed to know that the same console that plays Final Fantasy IV also plays Final Fantasy VI in some scenes. The sprite work is quite impressive alongside its use of Mode 7 to convey the illusion of a 3D space, and its amazing soundtrack really made it feel like the developers wanted to end this era with a bang. The soundtrack alone is a big driving force for me wanting to revisit the game in the future. Perhaps also saving Shadow and Cid is another one, but the music really did become an earworm after the fact. The final boss theme, Dancing Mad, is probably one of my favorite Final Fantasy boss tracks of all time, in addition to Kefka being my favorite Final Fantasy villain, although this may be more of my fondness for jester or clown-like characters in games. Compared to the other games in the series, Final Fantasy VI is probably the most casual in terms of difficulty. I didn't really feel the need to grind for levels up until the very end of the game, when Kefka ultimately humbled me in his final phase. Although I feel like I may have had a chance had I employed a different strategy. I felt that the combination of relics, espers, and special character attributes like Saban's martial arts really lowers the difficulty to a degree where you could forego the need to grind for experience, at least a decent amount. That is until you reach a wall, because don't get me wrong, there are a good chunk of difficult bosses that will test your ability to use the ATB system to its maximum extent. This is a easy yes. This game is a must play. So back in 2020, I, like many people, had way too much time on my hands, so I took to trying out different games that had come out that year. One of them was Final Fantasy VII Remake. 3 years later, and the next game in my Final Fantasy adventures was the original that had started it all for many. Final Fantasy VII is notorious these days for being overrated or overhated by many people in the community. It is a big hallmark of the series for many reasons. for being the first Final Fantasy not to release on a Nintendo home console, for being the first 3D Final Fantasy, and for having the largest presence in an otherwise untapped market that was the West, to name a few. The largest advantage Final Fantasy VII has over the other titles is just the fact that 7 is not only a single entry in a long-running series, it is the start of its own long-running series. Final Fantasy VII has had the benefit of having multiple entries in the same universe, with spin-offs like Crisis Core, movies like Advent Children, a whole remake trilogy, and multiple cameos in other games like Kingdom Hearts. And possibly having a prequel in the form of Final Fantasy X and X-2. Talking about the original Final Fantasy VII, however, and gameplay and story-wise, it's a bit of a toss-up whether or not it's an up, down, or side grade over the previous entry. For me, while I enjoyed the varied cast that was in Final Fantasy VI, I felt the characters in 7 were its strongest attribute. But again, this may be because of a lot of the characters being built upon over the 20+ years since its release versus a single entry that was 6. It is hard to deny the celebrity status of characters like Cloud, Barret, Tifa, Aerith, and Sephiroth. Plus, the limit break system's influence can be felt in future entries. In retrospect, I have noticed the parallels that are 6 and 7. They both have an artificially made super soldier that ultimately went crazy due to powers of ancient entities. The main leads are also characters that were experimented on and tortured, with them being under the control and influence of the villain at one point or another, just to name the more notable similarities. I did really enjoy the material system that was introduced in this game, as it provided an easy means of customizing characters to have either crazy stats, magic, or attack power, but grinding them up really was a bit of a chore. The grinding portion is at least remedied, even if the method is not intended, by using the item dupe glitch and giving elixirs to the pot enemies in the final dungeon. The version I had played was a retranslation project that I had loaded on my modded XStation PS1. This retranslation worked quite well, except in a single spot where I had to temporarily return to the original in order to get a summon materia on a lone island. For some reason or another, the game would think me picking up materia would engage the party into a boss fight that did not exist, and thus would softlock the game. I'm unsure if this glitch was something that only occurred on intended hardware, or if it was fixed in later patch releases. In the end, I really did enjoy FF7 in its original form. The low poly graphics that were revolutionary at one point have become quite charming to look at for me. I know a lot of people recommend playing the Steam port in order to have all the enhancement mods that up the poly count and include voice acting, but the stock standard original with an updated script still left quite the impression on me. I kinda wish, and this goes for a majority of the later Final Fantasies, that the player was able to skip the summon attack animations. Because while they are an amazing showcase for this new generation of consoles, I really would not want to see some of these animations more than once. Kings of the Round is probably the worst offender in this case. I highly recommend the original Final Fantasy VII to those who don't want to wait for the third part in the remake trilogy. Don't worry too much about spoiling yourself, as remake trilogy's changes are vast enough that I have ultimately concluded to see that the remakes are their own different continuity. Here's another S. It is revolutionary for a reason. Being the second black sheep in the series, Final Fantasy VIII deviates from the other games by introducing the magic drawing system and level-dependent enemies. This game is quite the oddity by having the playable characters be teenagers from military states disguised as large flying schools. Instead of being in a cyberpunky world, the world of Final Fantasy VIII is set in the modern age, just with magic and gun swords. Sticking to have a more realistic art style, Final Fantasy VIII is oddly very comfortable, but that may be due to the legendary OST. Love or hate this game, it's hard to deny the status of this game having an absolutely rock-solid soundtrack. Tracks like The Extreme or The Man with the Machine Gun are probably one of my favorites in the entire series. What did not stick with me was the card system. I know that Triple Triad is so noteworthy that it's a time sink for many, and even a problem for those that dabble in the MMO. I probably need a bit more time with it for its teeth to sink into me, but my first impressions were not the most positive. Maybe that just has to do with the different rule sets and the danger of losing my precious cards. Because I did thoroughly enjoy Rebirth's card game, Queen's Blood, enough to complete its overarching storyline, so maybe one day I'll give Triple Triad another chance. The drawing magic system alongside the junction system was a big learning curve that I had to get over to start appreciating or at least tolerating it. In some instances, I did miss the ability to just cast any spells I wanted with the tried and true MP system, but if you know what you're doing, you can very easily strut around with the catalog of extremely powerful spells and maxed out stats. I think its biggest flaw is the necessity for the player to know how to exploit the system to really make it fun by using the Guardian Force's abilities. This game's versions of summons do transform items or cards into powerful spells that can give an edge in battle once they're junctioned. Another big point I wanted to make is how sometimes it feels like the game actively punishes the player for playing as they would any other conventional turn-based JRPG. Using magic makes you weaker if those spells are junctioned, and once you're out, you need to spend precious time either exploiting the card game or spending a mind-numbing amount of time recouping magic from an enemy, or using a GF ability. Getting levels is largely not recommended, as once you reach certain thresholds, the world just simply matches your character's strength, so unless you're cheesing the game, again with the card game, you'll never feel all that powerful, and battles can and will take forever for those without the knowledge of these exploits. The limit break system that was reworked from the previous game was an interesting one. Instead of requiring the player to sustain enough damage to fill a gauge, the limit breaks in Final Fantasy VIII were situational feats of strength that rewarded risky play by having party members be at extremely low HP with one or multiple party members down. While not as visually impactful as, let's say, Cloud's Omnislash, the limit breaks in VIII were pretty cool, and Selphie's The End limit break is probably the strongest move in the entire series. I did enjoy the idea of having a pseudo crafting system that some Guardian Forces had alongside the weapon upgrade system that would be uncovered as the player discovered the weapon magazines throughout their travels. These weapon upgrades are even possible to craft without the said magazines if the player had the necessary items apparently. Part of me does wish there were more action commands for the other characters' basic attacks, as timing the R1 presses to Squall's Gunblade was pretty engaging. There are a good handful of moments that stuck around with me after the fact, like Odin being sliced in half by Cypher, and then Gilgamesh from Fantasy V appearing from the void as he later defeats Cypher with Odin's own blade. The other one being the largely ominous and honestly frightening ending cutscene. Speaking of ominous, Final Fantasy VIII's mystery sparked what I feel are probably the best fan theories. Alongside Final Fantasy X and X-2 being the prequel to Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII has some pretty famous theories like Squall is dead or Rinoa being Ultimisia. Ultimisia? So I'll give this a low B. It's a pretty large step down from 7 for me, but it's in no way a bad game. Ask any Final Fantasy veteran what their favorite Final Fantasy game is, and it's usually a toss-up of 6, 7, or 9. Final Fantasy IX is a return-to-form JRPG set in a more fantasy setting, instead of the steam or cyberpunk worlds that 6 and 7 heavily relied on. Because of this, I felt this game had the charm of having a varied cast of storybook characters that wanted to convey their own sets of themes on this journey. The most prominent theme of Final Fantasy IX is regarding the meaning of one's own existence. To what end does the living thing know what it means to exist, to know what they are and their place in the cycle of life? This whole thought process is probably why Vivi is a favorite character for so many, since they're ultimately an artificial being created to be a weapon of war. But at the same time, they are a normal living being with their own sets of thoughts and feelings. These weapons ultimately share an incredible amount of similarities to any living being, including the fear of death. It's the story and the characters that are ultimately Final Fantasy IX's best attribute. Aside from Amarant, I've really enjoyed every single character and their story arcs. There are some annoyances like Aiko's fangirling and Zidane's flirting, but in the grand scheme of things, nobody really feels out of place in this world. On the gameplay side of things, Final Fantasy IX takes more from the titles like 4 and 6. The ability to customize characters as freely as the previous titles isn't exactly a thing, so everyone has their own roles. Zidane is the lead warrior and thief, Vivi the black mage, Steiner the paladin/enhancer if Vivi is in a party with him, Garnet is the summoner/white mage, Freya is the dragoon, Kowina the blue mage, Aiko is the second summoner and white mage, and Amarant is the monk. There isn't anything too new to the battle system itself over the previous entries aside from the third version of the limit break system. Known as Trance, the limit breaks of Final Fantasy IX temporarily changes the form of the character and allows them to deal special attacks. For example, Zidane gets a variety of extremely powerful attacks. Vivi gets the ability to dual cast, and Sterner gets an overall attack buff. However, unlike the previous iterations of the limit break system, there really is no way to manipulate it. Trance just sort of happens, and more often than not, will be active when it is not necessary or when you can't use it to its fullest potential. Having the main character be a thief is also quite interesting, as this game has a heavier focus on stealing for rare and useful equipment. Nearly every fight has a list of useful items that should be a target to get before they're felled. However, this does mean that the truly useful drops quickly become feats of patience as you fight with good old Desire Sensor every time you have Zidane take a turn to get that final steal on a boss. I did really enjoy the fact that every piece of equipment would usually have a new attribute that would get learned once receiving enough AP. This really did make me choose whether or not to have a piece of equipment on in order to receive its skill, even if it meant I would be at risk of fighting with armor or weapons that are a step or two behind where I should be. Pairing this alongside the synthesis system was also a good idea on paper, even if it meant I would end up hoarding every piece of equipment I came across on the off chance it would turn into something new with a skill I don't have. As of late, I really want to return to Final Fantasy IX for its side content that I missed, like the Chocobo treasure hunts, the extra bosses, and the speedrunning challenge that is the Excalibur 2. However, I most likely will not do that on original hardware. Compared to the other Final Fantasies on a console, Final Fantasy IX is the slowest out of the three. It's slow to load into a fight, slow to start a fight, and slow to end if there's a notable steal that the enemy is holding on just a bit too hard. Final Fantasy IX also had its own card system, Tetramaster, and I understand why people still love Triple Triad over the many years versus Tetramaster. I feel like I need a good sit down with a professional as to break down the entire game, cause I legit feel like every game of Tetramaster just doesn't make sense. At the very least, Final Fantasy IX has a much lower focus on its card system over 8, and I'm pretty sure it's not required for any extra content besides the game itself. While I do see many of the game's strengths, like its unique art style that has aged super well versus 7 and 8, Final Fantasy IX ultimately doesn't blow me away like the previous entries. Sure, I love the characters and the overarching story and its themes, but maybe my expectations were set a bit too high because of fanfare, or my patience was ultimately being run thin after every 10-second loading sequence and camera pan for a normal encounter. I do feel the last point will be fixed by playing a more recent re-release of the title. Final Fantasy IX does have a lot good going for it, but it has a few nitpicks that limit it from being one of my top favorites. But even with all my complaints, again, I really do want to return and replay this title one day. So I'll just give this a high A. It's a fantastic game limited by its physical media. The 10th entry in the Final Fantasy series is the first break into the pre-HD era of game consoles. Having released on the mighty at the time PS2, this title had the luxury of being the first voice-acted title in the mainline series. Being a Ratchet & Clank fan since a very young age, I very quickly recognized Tidus' voice, being James Arnold Taylor. At the start of the game, it weirded me out hearing Ratchet as Tidus, but I did quickly warm up to the cast, and later on, upon learning of the limitations instilled on the English voice actors, I can only applaud them for the performance. Getting the context on the meme-worthy Tidus laugh was also quite eye-opening. When I ultimately did play this title, I vouched for playing the Switch HD remaster that came with a download code for 10.2. While the enhancements and changes the HD remaster did may be controversial to die-hard fans of Final Fantasy X, I simply just chose this version because of its ease of access. It is pretty crazy to think how the PS4, Xbone, and Switch have access to the entire legacy catalog of the series through these re-releases. I did find it quite interesting that Final Fantasy X really rolled back the battle system to be a turn-based one once again, but this time with the ability to see the timeline of turns during battle. This feature ultimately proved to be pretty engaging as the player can influence the turn sequence using moves that would give extra turns, priority, or even the opposite effects on the enemy. There are other games that use a similar battle system in indie titles like For the King 1 and 2 and Across the Obelisk. Even with this return to a more archaic form, Final Fantasy X is the second to most difficult game in the series. There were multiple bosses where your skills and preparation are put to the test, and even when grinding, the fight still proved to be a challenge. The most prominent bosses that left me feeling deflated being the second Seymour fight and Lady Yunalesca. However, I do admit that part of my difficulty may have been my resistance to doing the side content because of how linear feeling Final Fantasy X was. A lot of the game is essentially a hallway simulator and unless you know what to do and when, you can and will miss important side stuff like unit summoning trials and pieces to everybody's ultimate weapons. Of course, you don't need the best equipment to beat the game, but since I didn't want to submit myself at that time to learning blitzball, the infamous chocobo races, and monster catching, meant that on an equipment standpoint, I was left pretty unprepared for the entire game. Perhaps for similar reasons as Final Fantasy IX, I was just overtaken by the main story and wanted to see more of it without interrupting it with side content. It did probably help that in order to move ahead in the story, all I had to do was just hold up in many cases. But also like Final Fantasy IX, I do want to return to 10 with a guide in order to ensure that I experienced the side content that I had missed. The music in this game is also quite legendary. Being Nobuo Uematsu's final lead role as composer, I felt this game had a lot of his greatest work. Heck, just listening to the very first track in the game, I felt like I was going to witness another one of the best video game OSTs of all time. The spear grid is also one of the best skill trees I've had the luxury of using. Every character is connected one way or another on the grid, which allows for characters to leave their own class and learn whatever you have enough orbs for. Kimahri is probably the best example of this, since his tree begins at the very center, and since he is the blue mage of the group, you really do need to give him a speciality, either in the form of being an early thief or something else, as on his own, Kimahri is probably the worst character in the game to me on the gameplay side. Speaking of Kimahri's shortcomings, I felt like the limit breaks / overdrives in this game were a bit underwhelming as compared to the previous incarnations. I liked them more than the trance system in 9, but I did feel that it was odd that Kimahri can only use his useful blue magic as a limit break. Also, I just remembered, like, this is off script, but like Auron's thing, like when he says like, right now, during his overdrive, that goes kinda hard. All in all, Fantasy X is a rock-solid game that will make a good starting point for those with little experience in the genre. So that's a mid-A for insert Titus laugh. A word of caution for those buying the Switch version of 10 and 10.2's HD re-release, as 10.2 is not on a cartridge, and requires a download code in order to access the second game. Because of this, getting a used copy of the HD remaster will not guarantee that the code for 10.2 will still work. However, the PS4 release of 10 and 10.2 has both games on the disc apparently. Final Fantasy X-2 is an extremely interesting game as it serves as a complete tonal shift from the previous game. Going from a hard-hitting drama romance to an idle concert cold open, starting 10.2 is a big splash of cold water to the face if you're expecting anything like the previous game. The characters from the previous game, besides Yuna and Riku, are also not playable as they're essentially retired due to the eternal calm that was achieved in Final Fantasy X. Serving as the third character in the party, Pain, these three young adults essentially go on a victory lap around the world of Spira in hopes of searching for the correct spear that may solve where Titus went in the true ending of Final Fantasy X. There's a good deal of hijinks and tomfoolery to be had in this adventure, especially with minor villains like LeBlanc and her crew of goons. The main interesting bit to me is the use of the dress spears to essentially work as a class switching mechanic of Final Fantasy III and V. Alongside the ATB system making its return, Final Fantasy X-2 feels like an amalgamation of multiple games. So while it was nice to have the ability to swap equipped classes during battle, it did quickly become a bit of a nuisance to switch and watch the same transformation cutscenes over and over again. Even the shorter version of this transformation will quickly chew up playtime if you switch very often. Overall difficulty is lower than the previous game, but for similar reasons, there were portions that I had trouble with due to feeling a bit underleveled and lacking in classes. It feels like 10.2 is more chock full of side quests over the previous title, and so had a lot of goodies locked behind optional content, like the monster racing side game. It does feel like 10.2 is more geared towards the Final Fantasy fans that have been following the series for some time, due to having a multitude of references to previous titles in the forms of game mechanics. It's quite possible due to wanting to pander to fans that we get characters like Shinra, possibly hinting that the world of Spira is the same as Final Fantasy VII. So that's a high C. C for concert. So Final Fantasy has been somewhat known for a while to have nods to the Star Wars franchise in the forms of having recurring themes of rebellion and characters like Bix and Wedge. But Final Fantasy XII is regarded as being the game that is essentially Star Wars, but Final Fantasy. And I do agree that this game does share the same vibes that I would get whenever watching a Star Wars show or movie. Easy character comparison time. The female lead Ashe is a mirror to Princess Leia, Balthier, Han Solo, Fran, Chewbacca, Van, C-3PO, Penelo, R2-D2, with Gabref being Darth Vader. I guess it could be argued that Batch has at least one similarity to Luke in the form of having a family connection with the villain, but aside from that, that's where the similarities end character-wise. But probably another comparison that is not said too often or at all is how Fantasy XII is essentially a Final Fantasy Xenoblade title, even if this came way before the first Xenoblade on Wii. Totally distancing themselves from turn-based combat, Fantasy XII relies on real-time combat on the overworld. Granted, the player gets the option to have battles pause when going through the menu for using items, spells, or abilities. FF12 also totally removes random encounters from the game. Sure, there are enemies that can appear out of nowhere in dungeons, but the random encounters of old are no more in this title. There really is a sense of freedom while exploring this open world game over the other Final Fantasies. The Zodiac Age release that I played on the Switch has the bonus of having the reworked class system, which instead of using the spear grid of Fantasy X, uses a pseudo chessboard for unlocking class attributes and moves. It is a bit annoying how some attributes also include the ability to equip certain armors and weapons, since when buying equipment, the game will only note if it is an improvement on what is currently equipped, and does not note if the equipment can even be equipped due to not having the proper license unlocked. The Switch version of the Zodiac Age allows the player to reset the board if they choose to swap the job of a given character. But sadly, job switching is not as seamless as it is for 3, 5, or 10-2, as this would require the player to refill out the license board upon choosing a new job class. And telling from experience, reallocating LP for multiple characters can take up to a couple of hours to complete. The HD re-release also had the benefit of having a natural speed up by allowing the game to run at 2 or 4 times speed, which helps a butt ton when needing to grind for levels, items, or just to explore the area in a reasonable amount of time. The speed up is actually quite dangerous, as once you're back to normal speed, you do feel how much of a slog the game can be. Unlike the previous couple of titles, I took it upon myself to try and redeem my gamer cred, and I played as much of the content as I possibly could. This included doing every side quest I came across, getting every ultimate weapon per class, and doing all the hunts. Going back to the previous point of the speed up option, that speed increase was a godsend when I was dealing with the infamous multi-hour boss battle that is the final hunt. However, because of the amount of time I committed to doing the side content, I essentially completely lost track of what was going on in the story. I feel like I should have rewatched the cutscenes in order to get a refresher whenever something felt confusing, but I'm also pretty sure I wasn't the only one in the same boat when it came to the story. The characters were also a bit of a mute point. Sure, there were characters I really did love, like Balthier, Fran, and Ashe, but I largely felt that the other characters were just sort of there for the ride. This was especially true for the apparent main characters. While Van technically did have a reason for being in this misadventure, I felt both him and Penelo's involvement were extremely underutilized compared to Ashe and Balthier. Adding on to the previous point, I really do wish there were some more character interactions with the party. Maybe this is just coming from my experiences with character interaction in the Xenoblade titles, especially with how party members interact and talk with each other in Xenoblade 3. It feels like nobody in the party aside from the key 3 really need to be on this journey together, aside from the plot wanting it. Speaking of plot, Fran, who directly talks to Penelo a grand total of 1 time throughout the entire game, is quite notable for, 1, being the worst character in the game stats-wise, and 2, alongside Kimahri, being the basis for probably one of the most popular races that I see whenever I fail to dodge a glimpse of Fantasy XIV. I'm not a big fan of MMOs in general, but I did find it interesting to discover the introduction of these races in the Mainline series as I went along this journey. Fantasy XII is by no means a difficult game. If anything, it's more on the easy side due to the ability to grind up levels in a quick and easy manner with speed up. By the time I finished the game, I was essentially fully leveled, with only the super bosses and late hunts proving a challenge. Probably the main thing that mediated the difficulty was the ability to spam Phoenix Downs and revives when in danger. I nearly forgot that Fantasy XII even had a limit break system, as it was replaced with the quickening system. Essentially, quickenings were super moves that were able to be chained together with another character, and it continued if the player had a fast enough reaction speed to time their inputs. While powerful, I felt like I was able to do even more damage by spamming Flare and Ardor versus watching the same couple of cutscenes over and over again. While the game has you only control one character at a time, the game did introduce the Gambit system. Being Baby's first programming tutorial, the Gambit system allowed the ability for players to have control over every party member in some manner. What it essentially boiled down to was a series of if and then statements that would have a character do X command when X requirement is fulfilled. For example, using a Phoenix down when someone is felled, or using Ardor when there are 3 or more enemies in a battle. With its world building and gameplay taking focus in Final Fantasy XII, I felt the overall story and characters suffered in the long run. But even then, I did really enjoy this final hurrah for the pre-HD era of Final Fantasy. I'll give this a high B, because I swear Fran's butt is always in center focus in cutscenes. I'm just going to start off by saying that I did not like Final Fantasy XIII and felt that this entire trilogy started a Final Fantasy Dark Age for me. Being the first game to launch on the first HD era consoles, this game is still quite beautiful to look at when playing on the Xbox One. The original release of 13 is quite interesting as it is one of the very few multi-DVD releases on the 360, with the PS3 version being able to be crammed on a single Blu-ray by comparison. If you own an Xbox One or Series family of consoles that have a disc drive, you can insert the 360 version of the game into the system and download an enhanced version of the game that restores the FMVs to their Blu-ray counterparts, with the Series X also providing an FPS boost to the trilogy apparently. This also eliminates the need to swap discs when playing through the game. Probably the biggest thing that stuck out to me when playing 13 outside of its new level of graphical fidelity is just how bored I was playing through the game. I know people joke about Final Fantasy X being a hallway simulator, but 13 took that personally and made 90% of the game into a hallway. Sure, there are parts of the game where you have multiple paths, but multiple hallways don't exactly solve the dilemma of being railroaded the entire way through the game. The last 10% of the game that is not a straight hallway is just a big terrarium that is a home base to a slew of side quests that can only be done during this portion of the game. When I got to this part of the game, I really did feel like everything behind me was just an elongated tutorial, but that was until I was pushed back into the one-way track that was until the end of the game. Battles are back to being a more ATB-inspired affair, although the player is still allowed to control a single party member at a time. The attempted remedy to this dilemma is having 2 AI party members that will use moves according to their current role. More often than not, however, the whole idea of putting any thoughtful effort into battle is not worth it, because I was able to get through a majority of the game, aside from the big chapter bosses and the final boss, by just swapping paradigms and choosing auto every time. The ATB system in this game, known as the Command Synergy Battle System, was reworked to also work as a bar that would fill up entire segments. This was because depending on the move, a differing amount of ATB was required, which makes sense as stuff like weaker heals and spells can be spammed in quick succession, with stronger versions needing up to 3 bars of ATB in order to perform. There are 6 different roles that a character can be, with every party member having their own specialities. Commando has a character focus with physical attacks, Ravager has a heavy focus on magic, Sentinel is a defensive role that can tank hits while taking aggro, Saboteur does status ailments while Synergist buffs allies. Medic of course just heals any party members in need. What players are ultimately driven to do in every fight is use a combination of Commandos and Ravagers in order to fill up a stagger gauge. Stagger the enemy and then deal a whole ton of damage. A Commando's job is to upkeep the stagger gauge and deal damage when staggered, while Ravagers are meant to boost the gauge and take advantage of elemental weaknesses. Status ailments are incredibly powerful in this game, as enemies will attack relentlessly, so debuffing them is key to making any encounters much easier. In fact, it was quite notable how some status ailments were even usable on the final boss. There isn't really much need for healing outside of battles, as 13-1 and 2 will always begin a fight with everybody at full HP. Another form of the skill tree was also created in order to upgrade the roles characters would take. Sort of like the main game's theme, these trees give a false sense of freedom as they would ultimately guide a player through every segment as they unlock new skills and stat boosts. Upon getting enough levels, you were able to add on different roles to a character, but in most cases this was not very worth it in my experience. With how many crystal points it takes to upgrade a character to have a good moveset to be useful, you're better off just saving those points to upgrade the character's tree until they ultimately get maxed out, or until the next story beat. While the story was much more easily followable compared to 12, it was largely not too interesting either. I feel part of the blame was due to me not liking the characters. Lightning was essentially just a female Cloud, who also barely talks and keeps to herself, at least in this part is remedied as the trilogy progresses. Snow is a boring musclehead. Vanilla just kinda annoys me.
and Hope is just an edgy baby cloud who wants Snow dead for the first half of the game. Saz and Fang are the only two characters that I really did like in the first game though. At least it was interesting to see Sid as a villain again in this game. Plus, this game also didn't have any random encounters, and the player would get rewarded for sneaking up on enemies by getting a free couple of hits in. So, yeah, I'll just give this an E, because, you know, what's worse than a bad game? Being a boring game with pretty graphics. Final Fantasy XIII 2 is luckily an upgrade over a lot of the issues that I had in the first game. I guess that's easily solvable by removing a good chunk of the playable cast that I didn't gel with. 13.2 starts Noel, a time-traveling hunter, and Sarah, Lightning's younger sister and the fiancée to Snow. While the main idea of the combat system is not too different over the first game, there was an added element of monster catching and raising that at least kept things interesting. Sort of like SMT or Persona, there's a chance that a found monster will drop a crystal that contains them. The monsters are able to be leveled up like our characters, but ultimately have a max limit, which at least pushes the player to seek better and stronger monsters. Yes, the developers really take into account the many issues that people had with the first title. The big one, for me at least, having the story be a lot more engaging. Confusing at times because it ultimately revolves around time travel hijinks, kinda like Final Fantasy I actually, but more interesting at the very least than the first installment. The use of time travel does mean that we do revisit the same spots multiple times, but the incremental changes are at least interesting enough to look forward to a new area in the same spot to see what changed and how people are doing. One funny piece of trivia regarding the final boss, Jet Bahamut: when Jet Bahamut has Amber and Garnet Bahamut up, the trio are able to charge up the hallmark moves of Bahamut's previous incarnations: Neo Bahamut's Giga Flare, Bahamut Zero's Terra Flare, and Bahamut Fury's, from Crisis Core, Exaflare. I still find it funny how 3 souped-up Bahamuts are just able to pull off a spell that is a tier under what Donald Duck can do. Lightning Returns stars the one and only Lightning, who is tasked by Buenavelza to go save the souls of the inhabitants of the currently dying world. How exactly? By doing side quests. And the world is dying at quite the fast pace, as when Lightning wakes up, the world only has days until ultimately everything is wiped clean. Ditching the command synergy battle system, Lightning Returns employs a real-time battle system that is done in a separate arena. The player is granted access to changing Lightning's entire moveset, using abilities gathered from fellow enemies. As they progress through the game, stronger and costlier abilities can be obtained and upgraded to make them even more efficient and carry extra bonuses. The stagger gauge is still a constant throughout the trilogy, as it serves as the main method of felling foes in a quick manner. But alongside this return a different form of X2's Dress Spears. Throughout the game, Lightning is able to change her attire, granting up to 3 different movesets and bonuses depending on what the player has equipped. There are even some extra outfits that are DLC, like Lara Croft's outfit from the Tomb Raider reboot. Using the 3 outfits and abilities, the player is essentially given 3 separate ATB bars, all of which have different degrees of regeneration and maximum limits. Even with this, however, the main mentality of the previous 2 games are prevalent, as using magic and physical attacks is key to staggering. However, sometimes there are extra methods like status ailments or performing perfect blocks that can stagger certain enemies. While this game does employ a time limit, sort of like Majora's Mask, I felt the limit was pretty reasonable. It doesn't take that many side quests or even main objectives to add on an extra bit of breathing room, so time was never an issue. At least I didn't feel the pressure until the final couple of days. The time limit also does not expect you to do everything in the game, as there will be certain quests like defeating every single final monster that cannot be done easily in a single playthrough. It may be because of Lightning being the sole protagonist of this title, but I did feel that I grew to at least like her in this game. By the end, I did ultimately see her as her own person, and not just solely a gender-swapped cloud. It's pretty surprising how big Lightning is actually, since Square still has her as a fashion model in Japan apparently. Also, since this info was shared with me as I played through 13.1, Lightning's bust was actually increased in size for Lightning Returns, since one of the main mechanics of the game was a huge wardrobe of fashion and cosplay, and I guess the devs wanted her to look a bit more mature in this title. So, I'll give this a B, it's the best in the trilogy. Final Fantasy XV is infamous for its troubled development history, originally starting out as another installment in the Final Fantasy XIII universe, Versus 13. After being cancelled in 2012 and being rebranded as the next mainline title in the series, the game was finally released on home consoles and PC in 2016. Funny enough, this title was still the most recent game in the series when I started preparing to buy games for this series deep dive. Like Final Fantasy VIII, the setting is in the modern age, just with magic and massive dormant summons that act as deities in this world. We play as the Prince, Noctis, and the shields of the King, Gladius, Ignis, and Prompto. But of course, the most notable playable character is the car, the one and only Regalia. This marks the second game in the series to be truly considered an open-world title. However, this game prides itself on the lack of loading screens as the party travels the world, unlike the many segmented areas of Final Fantasy XII. Using the Regalia, the party is able to venture with nearly no restriction anywhere they want to go. The only limitations being the gas tank, the blockades, and monsters appearing at nighttime. I really did like driving the Regalia around in its Type D form, as that provides an easy method of going off-road without too many drawbacks. Plus, the Regalia is able to jump impressively high. It kinda sucks, however, that even a single percentage of damage is able to completely ruin the look of the car, but any excuse to see Cindy isn't exactly a bad one. The main annoyance I had with this game was its magic system, which took a bad page out of Final Fantasy VIII and only allowed the prince to siphon magic from certain areas, usually around a campsite. And then through a series of menus you were able to equip the magic in the same slots where a weapon would go. This felt extremely cumbersome, and while I understand why they did this since magic is extremely powerful, maybe wish that the magic was tied to the already existing MP system. This was also the first time there was a mainline Final Fantasy game that was fully action-focused. I am pretty sure there are accessibility options to help those who would rather take things slowly, but when it comes to being an action JRPG, there isn't really a whole ton of depth to it. The game attempts to have some semblance of depth to it by having last-minute dodge and blocks, but ultimately anything that is really cool looking is a QTE. Plus, any semblance of challenge is tossed out of the window by having a massive reserve of regular potions, as Phoenix Downs are only needed when a player loses their entire health bar while downed. Compared to other titles, it does feel like Final Fantasy XV pushes the player to replay the title for the extra post-game goodies, like being able to max out the multiple extremely expensive upgrade trees and the flying airship upgrade to the Regalia. This playthrough of the Final Fantasy series is of course mainly focused on the main completion of the given entry, but it's nice to know there's a lot more in store for people who want to hear Ignatz continue to say, "I dare say I could make this a camp," every time the player opens a new flavor of Doritos. Story-wise, I felt it was interesting to have a movie tie-in alongside the game, Kingsglaive, which adds a bit more context to the attack on the Kingdom of Lucius. It's not super crucial to the overall story, but like the game, it is quite the good-looking movie, even if the characters look a bit uncanny at times. The rest of the story can essentially be summed up as a group of 4 bros going on a very, very long road trip. I would probably return to this game in the future in order to get the final Royal Arm that I missed alongside experimenting with the Flying Regalia upgrade. But there are also a slew of DLC packs that star each of the party members. This game is by no means the best open world game that I've ever played, but exploring is pretty fun, and even just driving around is quite relaxing. Oh, and plus you could fish. So I'll just give this a low B for, for boom boom, for the car, boom boom. Finally, the most recent entry in the Final Fantasy series. Final Fantasy XVI was released on the PS5 and then later Steam, and is the natural step up in graphics and comforts, such as the fast loading times thanks to having a high-speed flash storage on the PS5. It does feel like the game is a bit too much for the console sometimes, as I remember hearing multiple recounts of people's consoles overheating while playing. In fact, I got an overheating message during a cutscene. While humorous, it made me think whether or not having my PS5 on its side had an impact on temperature. I did take off the side panels of the console after this particular session of 16 to ultimately see that there wasn't any dust accumulation, so who knows. Like the previous entry in the series, Final Fantasy XVI is also an action JRPG that stars the charming Clive Rosfield, who was the firstborn of the family, but was appointed as the first shield of his younger brother due to him being seen as a failure for not being chosen as the dominant of the Phoenix.
Set in a much more traditional fantasy setting, the world of 16 is inhabited by large kingdoms with knights, wizards, and a wide variety of vicious creatures. Some of these creatures being powerful dominants, people who are able to essentially transform and wield the power of notable summons in the Final Fantasy series. Combat is much more skill and reaction based over the previous game, and in my eyes, is a massive improvement in every sense. Granted, fighting can get tiresome and repetitive, but the player does come across a variety of different moves and special abilities as the player progresses through the story. You can essentially say that Clive is the Mega Man of the Final Fantasy series, as he has the ability to steal a dominant's abilities when they are defeated in battle, adding to his already powerful arsenal. The story was pretty simple, but at least it was also quite engaging, as it kept my attention with its many cinematic cutscenes. While not the most groundbreaking story that I have ever experienced, I felt the sentiment of having a ton of hype moments in order to supplement an otherwise not overly original story is the best way to describe Final Fantasy XVI's narrative. I think the whole battle against a maddened Bahamut is probably a good example of this, because you know for a fact the feat of durability and strength that was overpowering Bahamut's Zeta Flare is going to be something a lot of people are going to talk about as the years pass. While 16 may not have as much content as the other entries in the series, I feel this game is quite kind for completionists, as doing every side quest and hunt didn't really take too long, as compared to say 12. The only thing that I missed was doing the extra trials for the final missive, but that's always something I could do during a New Game Plus playthrough. Combing through the trophy list also made it appear that getting a platinum isn't too bad, but without trying to get all the achievements myself, I cannot really say that with too much certainty. There are extra DLC campaigns to play down the line, but quite honestly, I felt that the main game itself was quite satisfactory. Plus, I'm not exactly too sure about the fan sentiment regarding these packs. One really neat thing I did notice was a near 50% achievement rate of completing the main story, which is actually extremely impressive, especially for a title that sold as many copies as 16 did. So grade-wise, we'll give this an A for all the screaming that is done in this game. Well, hopefully my brief review of every title isn't too controversial. What are your guys' favorite entries in this long-running series? While I did put a grade next to each title, I feel that my opinions can change over time, and after every playthrough of a given game. Plus, with how different and varied each game can be, it sometimes doesn't exactly feel that fair to judge a turn-based RPG versus, say, an action one, or a tactical one, or an MMO, etc. Still, this has been quite the fun journey to go on, and I look forward to playing the next new entry in the Final Fantasy series. Unless it's an MMO, because MMOs they're not mainline entries.